Welcome to the Bassanda podcast. I'm Chris Smith. This is a space for riffing upon history and upon speculative fiction, for world building, for comedy and dialogue and badinage, for bad jokes, historical ironies, and the imagination of a kinder, gentler, richer, and more creative universe. Bassanda, the mythical nation, originates in the fertile musical and ancillary imaginations of my friends Roger Landis and Chipper Thompson, and you can find their links in the show notes. When, as a friend of the General and the Reverend, I was first playing with the idea of a fictional alternate universe identity for my own TTU Celtic ensemble, I realized that perhaps I didn't have to invent a world if the lads were willing to let me borrow Bassanda. They were, and here we are. The first speculative fiction novel set in this universe, which is serialized at smithscribe.substack.com, is The Great Train Ride for Bassanda. This podcast episode, number 7, takes off from chapters 15 through 17 in Great Train Ride. By now, we've already met the main POV characters and most of the team they're assembling, or which is assembling them, including James Lincoln Javier Lawrence, Ismail Durang, Algeria Mainsmith, Colonel Torres, and General Landis. This is the part that's like the opening of The Seven Samurai, or The Magnificent Seven, or even Ocean's 11. And honestly, if I could get within hollering distance of any of those team flicks, I'd figure I'd be doing pretty well. On the other hand, in The Great Train Ride, not all these characters have linked up yet at this point in the narrative, or found much emotional connection, so there's something to be said for introducing them to one another. It gets to be another layer of interesting if Cecile, as principal POV, belatedly realizes through the characters' interactions with one another that some of them might have a shared prior history or even prior conflict. Or, in the case of the professor and Ismail, who've never met, the professor has a very decided opinion of Ismail, based upon what he thinks he already knows about Ismail's deadly side. The cranky old bastard has been enlisted in the cause, but he's not at all convinced that his companions in this revolutionary mission are people with whom he wants to be associated. So setting up that conflict, that disdain with which the professor views the assassin, and the complexity of Ismail's and Cecile's feelings in return, makes a later turn at the climax of Act 2 much more poignant and powerful. For Chapter 15, which is entitled A Meeting at the Museum, the time period and the Parisian setting also provided a great mise-en-scène. Because at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, there was a heyday for expositions, both anthropological and technological. There was an opportunity to set the scene in the Musée d'Anthropologie, an evocative locale which reveals both the imperial extraction which had fueled the Paris Exposition, like the later World Columbian Exposition in 1893, and also the high-flown aspirations to which these empires aspired in the coming century. The Musée was a real place, built in the 1870s in some of the buildings left over from the Paris Exposition. There's a parallel there to the plaster and lath buildings erected as part of the 1893 World Columbian Exposition in Chicago below the Loop, on land that was reclaimed in order to build this very temporary city, and which marked a confluence of new century impulses and a whole lot of colonialism. I've always been kind of fascinated by the Columbian Exposition because of these factors, because it's such a classic example of hegemonic thinking. That is, more primitive cultures were located closer to the lake, distant from the city. The white Anglo and Northern European cultures were closer to the city. But I've also been interested, for example, in the less white supremacist contact that went on around the exposition's edges. The introduction, for example, of a bunch of world cultures to North America, and the World Parliament of Religions, which really was a watershed in North American awareness of Hinduism and Buddhism. So the Parisian Musée de la Trocadéro also let me set up some backwards connections to earlier and colonized cultures, and to establish that some of these, especially the Creole cultures of the French Imperial Caribbean, on which I've done some work in my music history day job, may resonate in both events and perhaps even some mythological characters who are going to show up in our narrative. This thus maintains both the Imperial European extractive thread, which is going to be really important in making the Russian invaders of Bassanda the villains, but also in hinting at some of the ways the little peoples and indigenized and colonized cultures are going to use older magic and older wisdom to fight back. Chapter 16, On the Orient Express, also marks the end of Part 1, that is the end of the beginning, and the opening of Part 2, when the team exits Paris and sets off eastward into the unknown. Maybe there's a little parallel with the hobbits leaving Rivendell and Fellowship of the Ring, and the sense of moving beyond one's known world, traveling into the unknown with companions one hasn't known very long, or at least not in this kind of hazardous undertaking. It's a tool for marking Cecile's sense of finding her way into this team, but it's also a way of deepening her understanding of these people who have longer, more ambiguous, more involved personal backstories than her own. I'm wanting her to feel a little bit young and a little bit naive, and perhaps resentful of those others' greater wisdom, skill, and experience. Sticking with Cecile as POV, but now out of her element, and in the somewhat floaty sense of being encapsulated on the express, simultaneously sitting in comfort and watching beautiful picturesque landscapes scrolling past the train's windows, seemed fruitful. We can also use Cecile to tell us more about Ismail, and to suggest, if only by the quality of her attention, that she's intrigued by and may find herself attracted to him. Her attraction actually shows us his charisma indirectly. That he is physically charismatic provides an interesting and useful POV challenge of imagining what sexual desire might feel like for this woman. But it also lets us maintain some tension between that attraction and Cecile's ambivalence because of the professor's negative perceptions of Ismail. It lets us keep hinting about different aging processes found amongst Rift travelers, because we're told that although, quote, Ismail's appearance was that of a young man in his very early 20s, he showed an intimate, sometimes first-person familiarity with events of 40 or 50 years before. On the other hand, that emotional ambivalence might echo outward a bit. It might bounce and cause a bit of a shift in how the professor himself is thinking about Ismail, because either he has to devalue his actual respect for Cecile's judgment, or he has to rethink what he believes he knows about Ismail. So this deepens and complicates all these relationships, and that in turn is going to be important in the future narrative, as it is in any narrative. There's also a bit of hiding the seams going on in this chapter as well, because somehow we have to provide an explanation for why the most demonstrably badass members of the team, that is the Colonel, the General, and Madame Algeria, can't stay with the others to protect them on the train. We need to separate them, because we need the Professor, Cecile, and Ismail to be on their own and vulnerable. That's how we challenge them to face danger and grow together. It's not dissimilar to what happens maybe at the end of Tolkien's Fellowship, when, spoiler alert, the Nine Walkers are sundered and split into 3 groups who won't be reunited until the 3rd book in the trilogy. In my case, we handle it by having the Brethren, including Algeria, be too noticeable to the Russians, so they peel off in order to decoy enemy pursuit, the way that Aragorn and Gandalf's crew later attacks Mordor to distract the Great Eye, because after all, Tolkien was hiding some similar narrative seams as well. On a character level, it's a way for Cecile's new bonds with the Brethren to be tested. How much has she already come to depend upon them? How scared is she when they depart? How much can she and the Professor count on Ismail? We're going to find out answers to all these questions in the next chapter. This is a small crisis, fairly swiftly resolved, that will then boomerang back bigger in Act 3. Chapter 17, Eastward on the Orient Express, continues that sense of an idyllic pastoral interlude, but there's also supposed to be a little bit of the Jaws effect, or of the shark beneath the surface. That is, the beauty and sameness of the days, lulling wariness to menace that may lie beneath. She's having something of an armchair adventure amid a comparative lack of perceived risk, but she is still also having nightmares, and those nightmares are going to come into her waking days as well. She's getting to know the Professor a bit better and differently, while Ismail remains a distant but visible presence, a bit of a memento mori in the pastoral picture, and this chapter is going to end with a cliffhanger. The central scene, which is an action sequence, is another of those scenes that I saw in my mind's eye, and so I had to figure out how to get into it and what it connoted, and how it might further the narrative. I knew she'd wake up alone, not knowing why the carriage is deserted, but knowing that the absence of other travelers is ominous. And I had that picture of, quote, a ghost train running through the dim, gray hills of Alsace. It's set up so that we're not sure whether it's in fact a ghost story, some invisible or maybe even just imagined presences, or whether there is actual tangible danger. The scene is full of electromagnetic connotations, flickering lights and lost illuminations. And electromagnetics are going to be important not only throughout the Bassanda corpus, but also within the body of this story. They're what power a train the team later boards. They may have something to do with Rift travel, and electromagnetics most definitely are key elements in the devices which the documents the team is carrying diagram. Mostly, though, I wanted the scene to have some drive, some sense of kinetic action, which is easier to convey in images or even sounds than in prose. Which is one reason, I suppose, why the action sequence is mostly a string of vivid visual images, sometimes big and sometimes small, with a couple of different jump scares built in. It's also an interesting problem, to find a prose that accelerates. that uses shorter sentences, more immediate images, even fragments, and smash cuts. Shock. Immediately after the climax of the scene, Cecile's internal POV lets us see her experiencing a tumbling set of realizations, that Ismail is a true protector, that Algeria and the colonel have, unexpectedly and without warning, but just at a crucial graphic moment returned, and finally, that some adversaries know for a fact that Cecile and company are on the train, and thus, suddenly, the danger is made to seem very close, very mysterious, and very real. Thus, the cliffhanger. This is the Bassanda podcast, a place for riffing upon history, for world building, for comedy and dialogue and badinage, for bad jokes, historical ironies, and the imagination of a kinder, gentler, richer, and more creative universe. Each week we recall chapters in the correspondence, and we talk with guests from the multiverse and beyond about world building and imagination. You can find us on your podcast app, and also Twitter, Threads, and Blue Sky. Search #Bassanda Podcast, send to bassandapodcast@gmail.com, or find me at Chris Smith Muso. I'd love to hear from you, and I'll talk to you again soon.